I'd like to go ahead and introduce today's speaker. Professor Azza Karam is Professor of Religion and Development at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. She also served in different positions in the United Nations since 2004, and she is currently Secretary General-elect of Religions for Peace, the organization I just mentioned. Professor Karam recently received the aforementioned Roosevelt for Freedoms Award on behalf of the organization Religions for Peace. She is widely known for her expertise in religion and development. Her experience spans from human rights and multi-religious cooperation to gender and sustainable development. We cannot thank Professor Karam enough for making time in her busy schedule to join us today all the way from New York, I believe, to talk to us about this important theme. Just a practical note for our participants before we start really quick. Professor Karam will have the floor for about half an hour, and that will be followed by an open Q&A session. And all of you are free and most welcome to participate in that and to ask questions, but please do type your questions in the chat in the lower right-hand part of your screen. I will be moderating the chat, so I will be, in the Q&A session, I will be reading out your questions to Professor Karam and asking her response. So that's how, logistically, that's how this is going to work today. Professor Karam, it's a great honor to have you here. Thanks again for your cooperation and your willingness to share your thoughts with us today. I will give the floor to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Pargas. Actually, I am the one who's very honored and privileged to be with you here today and to be invited to be able to engage with you. Your own work deserves great admiration, and I am thrilled that the organization that I have the privilege to serve has indeed been gifted with a reward that your work is closely associated with. I just wanted to correct a couple of things. So I am not elect anymore. I have been elected. I serve as of a year now, since March. I actually have this responsibility to serve as the Secretary General of Religions for Peace. And for those who may not know, which is of course many people, when we think of the United Nations, we think of governments, an institution that is made by and composed of and serves governments. Religions for Peace is in many respects the United Nations of the religious institutions of the world. So this is an organization that is made by and serves and in a sense is accountable to the religious institutions and faith communities around the world. So in the UN, the members are governments. In Religions for Peace, the members are religious institutions and representatives of faith communities, all faith communities. So that would be all the way from the Vatican or the Holy See to the indigenous communities around the world. The entire spectrum of faith, institutions, and representatives is what Religions for Peace is composed of and exists to serve. Thank you for that very gracious introduction, in which indeed you made it clear that our primary function as Religions for Peace is to convene the religious institutions and their representatives of faith communities together to serve together that which is identified as the common needs and the common good. That defines precisely who Religions for Peace is, or what it is, and what it is meant to do. Now, this has been happening for 50 years. There is a global headquarters, if you will, and then there are 5 regional interreligious councils. The global headquarters is an interreligious council. It's all of these different religious institutions and faith communities. The regional institutions are the interreligious councils, and then we also have about 90 national interreligious councils. Each interreligious council has representation from the faith communities and religious institutions in that particular national or regional context. So that's the structure of Religions for Peace, and the work has been going on now for just over 50 years of convening religious leaders, institutions, communities, not just leadership, but grassroots, women of faith, and youth, interfaith youth networks, whose main purpose is to convene to serve, to identify what areas of work they do and actually serve in those different spaces. So public health has been an area, obviously, common need, common good, has been an area of a tremendous amount of work. Human rights has been the founding space and principle. So 51 years ago, the religious leaders came together. At the time, it was the height of the nuclear. We haven't changed very much, I must say. There was a tremendous concern at that time about rising poverty levels, real fear generated by the nuclear competitiveness between nations for whom war or nuclear war didn't seem to be as generating as much fear as it did for most people. And at that time, the religious leaders of the world felt that their efforts as religious leaders that represented and were accountable to many, many, many people around the world, they felt that they should be supporting the multinational, the multilateral system, that they should be very deliberate in their efforts to stand together, to come together in solidarity as faith communities in order to support the multilateralism of the United Nations at that time, 51 years ago, to be very strong partners to the multilateral system from the religious spaces and perspectives. And this mission was built on ensuring that they could bring their faith communities, their religious institutions together to serve together. What were they serving? Human rights, peace and security, and development, human development. So exactly the same pillars that the United Nations itself stands for. This is, therefore, that commitment made to work actively in solidarity with one another at national, regional, and global levels to serve the mandates of peace and security and human rights and development. This is as brief a description of religious peace as possible, and I look forward to being able to elaborate more if people have any particular questions. But the theme of my talk today is on that particular nexus between religions and human rights. And I think it's very important for me to state at the outset, it's not religion. There's no such thing as religion. There are religions, there are faith communities. This notion that we often have of, so, well, it's one religion, or this rubric of religion includes everything under it, is a bit problematic. Yes, there are many tenets to faith that are shared. And this is, I think, the outset of the sharing that I want to do today. I will not talk concepts and theory. I will talk very, very pragmatic, practical dynamics. So bear with me, because I'm going to be sharing reflections and stories based on praxis. I will not honor so much of what is being written in this space. And only 20 years ago, it was kind of rare to find some good writing on religions, or religion, as it seems to always be referred to, religion and development, religion and foreign policy, religion and economic this, or religion, whatever. It was kind of odd, but unfortunately, that lack of awareness was really only pertinent to the Western, especially European hemisphere, where secularization, or the idea that religion should be put aside, is a private business, doesn't and should not be engaged in any public policy space or the public space. That notion is a very Western European notion that frankly never applied to the rest of the world, was never the reality of the rest of the world. But interestingly enough, that understanding, that vision of religion as relegated to, contained areas of life that did not and should not interact with the public space, was an exclusively Western European phenomenon that dictated a great deal of public perception, knowledge, and engagement, or lack thereof, with religious actors. So the rest of the world didn't have that quote unquote luxury of saying, well, religion is not really important for us. We're not going to talk religion. We're not going to do religion. That particular philosophy was never a part of the rest of the world. But somehow it structured the knowledge about the rest of the world hugely. So we all grew up and learned and studied about religions from a Western secular European narrative and perspective, which actually didn't take into account the reality of how the rest of the world lived religions, lived faith, and didn't avoid it, couldn't avoid it. It is part of our everyday lives. So there's an interesting point to bear in mind here, that now that we're interested in looking at this myriad ways of looking at religions and human rights, it's as if we're approaching a new space, when in fact it's much older than our own consciousness, so to speak. Indeed, the argument that would be made here is that we wouldn't have had human rights if we hadn't had our religious convictions and precepts and jurisprudence and lived realities. That in fact religions came first, then human rights came built on that which is common, the values common to all religions. So indeed, when we talk about human rights today, and since its inception as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if we look at this reality, we must understand that if we didn't have these religious values, it would have been extraordinarily difficult to have arrived at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is built on the common values to all faith traditions. So just that small wee piece of history that we've overlooked in our attempt to see from a secular Western European paradigm, to see religion is not really important. In fact, religions have helped us define what today we hold very dear and many hold almost sacred, which is human rights. So if we didn't have religions, we wouldn't have been able to have the human rights that we are talking about today. Human rights are built on the values common to all faith traditions. That is a very important reality to keep in mind. Now, given this particular paradigm, it's actually very late in the day that we now start talking about, well, let's see how religions and human rights interact or engage, or is there a discrepancy or not, and how does this work? So this relatively new way of looking is in and of itself a reflection of the fact that we're still continuing to look, our worldview is still very much structured by a very Western secular paradigm, which again actually doesn't reflect the reality of most of the world. Most of the world, as we heard in we saw a Pew Research study that showed us that in 2012, that indicated that 8 out of 10 people around the world profess to a particular religious belief. So 8 out of 10 people will claim a religious affiliation. And so the question is, so where did we come up with this idea that religions don't matter? That somehow, yes, I believe, I profess to a particular belief, and 8 out of 10 people around me professes to religion and sees religion as important to us in our lives. We affiliate ourselves with a particular faith, but that doesn't matter. That really doesn't matter. We're still looking at the world from a secular perspective. We still live our lives in a very secular way, where religion doesn't really matter, does not really impact on public policy or whatever. So the reality from that, now, doesn't mean, by the way, this particular reality that was juxtaposed in that Pew Research study in 2012 doesn't mean that every single 8 out of 10 people have the same way of relating to their religious tradition or their faith or their beliefs. Of course, every one person will relate very differently and see it very differently. But the point here is that religions matter to 8 out of 10 people in some way, shape, or form around the world. And I think it's important for us to keep that in mind. Now, forgive me for this rather long introduction, but I want to be able to walk with you, if you'll bear with me, on 4 particular aspects. The first is to maybe position pragmatically, from a very practical perspective, where religions or cultures and human rights meet and how. The second will be to look at why religions matter. The third will be to look at how religions matter to the human rights and humanitarian dimensions. And the fourth segment is going to be what I call the deal breaker and the tensions of the multi-religious, right? So we go from talking about religions to the multi-religious space, which I believe is where we are today in terms of our realities, but it's also where Religions for Peace is very much positioned at the heart to serve, and therefore can speak knowledgeably based on half a century of engaging in this space, the deal breaker, the multi-religious space. So let me begin by just quickly saying, Actually, in the last several decades of international development and human rights work, a number of themes have emerged, which underline the importance of working within the nexus of human rights and culture or cultural sensitivity. So we kind of approach religion through the portal of culture, culture being the less politically sensitive, less religiously problematic. We can speak about culture. Yeah, of course, culture. Culture, in this case, including very much issues that are relevant to faith, belief, and so on. But also gender dynamics, because much of our work on gender relations, which is not incidental, it's not marginal, it's very central, because it's about how we identify ourselves, each one of us, and how we relate to one another. So they're therefore very foundational. And because it's very foundational to who we are as human beings, it is also very powerful for us to understand that these gender domains or dimensions are informed by our cultural spaces, beliefs, realities. So one of the learnings on culture in international development over the last few decades has been that if you want to encourage communities to incorporate universally recognized rights into their own realities, you want to make sure that communities are not just thinking of human rights as something elevated over there, but it's actually part of their human rights, is part of their who they are and what they do, and own their human rights. That in order to do so, it's important to understand that legislation in and of itself is critical. You need your laws to be human rights based, oriented, and so on. But clearly, legislation alone has not been sufficient. Let me make that point again. For human rights to matter, for human rights to be realized in our lives, legislation, the laws that govern us, the rule of law is absolutely critical, but insufficient. So in order to catalyze the ownership of human rights and the realization of it in our daily lives, our cultures matter. Now, what do I mean when I talk about cultures? I mean, very broadly and loosely defined, cultures as the set of factors which influence the way people think, believe, and behave. Let me say that again. The set of factors which influence the way people think, believe, and behave. Culture. In other words, it's the oxygen that feeds into people's daily lives through the very fabric of who they are. It is culture's determinant of people, but culture is also determined by people. And no culture, by the way, exists without some kind of a relationship or an understanding or an incorporation of faith, what people believe in. So even the most secular of cultures, which position religion as, or faith as, an external, marginal, personal, private domain, even that way of positioning religion as outside of the important center, even that is a relationship with faiths and with religion. So whatever the perspective that religions matter to who we are and how we are, or religions don't matter to who we are and how we are, either way, it's a relationship between culture and religion. Either way, religions are part of culture, whether as integral or as marginal or deemed marginal. So these are some of the important parameters that I would like us to understand how we're approaching this in. Now, even if the relationship with religions in any societies is one of being very even disenchanted, shall we say, with any faith-based institutions, whether the church or a political regime that claims to be religious, whether the relationship is one of antagonism, even with politically active groups who are claiming religion, non-state actor groups, whatever that relationship is, there is an affiliation between religions and the cultures of think, believe, behave that structure human behavior. So we now understand, especially thanks to this COVID pandemic, we understand that promoting any behavioral change, for example, to vaccinate or not to vaccinate, a clear contemporary thing happening around us, that behavioral dynamic is very much impacted by what we choose to believe, what we choose to honor in the way that we behave and the way that we live our lives. So clearly, behavioral change, behavior is impacted by the decisions we make, the beliefs that we have. If our beliefs tell us, well, we don't have enough scientific evidence to show that the vaccine is a good idea, we won't vaccinate. And there are plenty of implications there, which I need not go into. But I think the point I'm trying to make here is that behavioral change, behaviors are very much influenced by what we believe and by what we think. And therefore, it's impossible not to see faith or faith-based or faith-induced dynamics as related to some of this. Even if that faith is not to believe in a religious institution or religious tradition, it's still a faith. So our cultures determine plenty of how we believe and of what we believe and how we behave, and in turn are determined by that. So for those seeking to realize social and political transformation, the idea emerged in the last 25 years or so that we need to work with what we called agents of change. You want to influence people to vote in a particular way. You want to influence people to not do certain harmful traditional practices, or indeed to do them, to continue with them. Whether I'm thinking female genital mutilation, but there are so many other harmful traditional practices out there. Whatever it is that we're trying to get people to address in their behavioral dynamics that requires a certain decision, that in order to do so, to realize those behavioral changes, we need to work with agents of change or influencers, right? So to own human rights, to realize human rights, to live our human rights, we are also looking at and working with influencers. That's why we sometimes position these very famous people to be the ambassadors of something or other. You're trying to change a way of behavior and positioning those who can influence people's behavior. This is particularly relevant, although not only relevant, to things that have to do with gender relations in society, but it's also relevant to political decision-making in general. In the United States, issues of abortion are so central to the voting praxis that you can't possibly say religion has nothing to do with it. It very much has something to do with it, because it's different religious groups who are making certain arguments that are religiously inspired, either for or against the right in question. So no matter where we are, there is a relationship there, cultural dynamics that include the religious and the faith considerations, which are influencing behaviors. So it makes very little sense to think of behavioral change and to think of decision-making that will influence people in either way, shape, or form, that doesn't take into account the cultural context, and therefore has to also take into account the religious dynamics in place. Now, I trust that this explains why culture is significant, religion is significant there too, and why that is in itself significant for public policy decision-making, as well as behavioral choices done at the individual or at the group level. Now, having made that particular argument, so I go to the second part: why do religions matter? In other words, what is the impact of religion on a country's cultural realities and on its human development? So I quoted already to you the Pew poll of 2012, right? 80% of the world's population claims a religious affiliation. Fine, we know that seems to be the reality. Now let's look at other reasons, and there's but 6 reasons I identify for why religions actually matter in our societies. 1, religious actors, whether they are in religious institutions, churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, etc., whether they are religious leaders who, or faith leaders who are acknowledged to be intellectual leaders in their own community, whether they are indigenous leaders in their own community, actually act as social and cultural gatekeepers in most societies. And again, if we want to transform behaviors and attitudes, social and cultural norms. We need these leaders, these gatekeepers. We have to at least acknowledge their existence because they are influencing the way people think, believe, and behave. So as social and cultural gatekeepers, the changes that we require in our individual behavior, our group behavior, even our public policy, have to take into account these religious dynamics and beliefs, realities. Okay, let's call them beliefs if religion seems to be very problematic for some people. So if we understand very clearly that apart from Western Europe, the rest of the world has maintained faith as a central part of how people think, believe, and behave, then we understand that we cannot afford to marginalize the religious in our understanding of that particular context and what is happening therein. Second, the largest, oldest, and most far-reaching social service providers. Now, what is social service? Health, education, nutrition, sanitation, social services. What today we call development. Yeah. The largest, oldest, and most far-reaching social service providers are religious institutions. Long before we had governments that provided ministries of health and ministries of education and the structures that we are familiar with today, long before, since, during, until today, churches actually operate and serve many health system infrastructures around the world. Schools, heard of madrasas? Anybody? Those are religious schools based in religious spaces, provided by religious spaces. So in fact, when we think in terms of, this hospital, this hospice, this clinic, this school, the original providers of these services from time of human memory have been religious institutions. That's just a fact. So we can dispute how much percent it is today of these institutions still in providing these services. We can dispute it from here to kingdom come. And goodness knows there are people who do that for a living. But the truth of the matter is that the original and the still serving social service providers are religious institutions in different guises. 70% of hospitals in the United States of America are still provided through, by, managed in some way, shape, or form through the Catholic Church. And I'm a Muslim, yet I went to a Catholic school, primary school, in my own country, in the Middle East. So the truth of the matter is, social services, we know them today, are very much what religious institutions provide. Now, tell me that we provide the services for all these decades, but we have no influence on the way people think, believe, and behave. Really? Third, to this minute, and more so during the COVID pandemic, we know that the first responders in humanitarian crises, whether they're man-made crises or whether they are natural disasters, the first responders, at least 4 out of the top 10 global humanitarian NGOs, are religiously inspired. Okay? We flock to the mosque when there's an earthquake, or when there's a fire, we go to the church. These institutions still continue to be the original humanitarian actors. Those of us who know about the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, it wasn't just by chance that they're called the Red Cross and the Red. Of course, today they're completely secular spaces, but why were they called the Red Cross and the Red Crescent? Because they were inspired by religious beliefs and today serve to be the largest humanitarian actors around. There is a connection, a strong connection between beliefs and services as we know them today, no matter how much we have secularized our understanding. We also know that, number 4, their religious institutions, religious leaders, religious actors are today heavily vested in and with politics, political parties, politicians. Religious leaders and some movements and entire religious infrastructure today are partners in actions and sometimes spiritual advisors. The White House has a prayer breakfast every year. Prayer breakfast in the White House. Many examples abound. We only think Iran, Saudi Arabia. In fact, the relationship between the religious and the political infrastructures is one of the oldest relationships, because some of the oldest political entities were religious, actually. So importantly, remember Ottoman Empire, where was that? That was Muslim, Islamic. Oh yeah, just by chance. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was Christian just by chance, really? 100-year war in Europe between Protestant and Catholics. It was just by chance. It didn't have anything to do with religion. I mean, come on. We know that politics and religion have been a very, very heady part of one, actually. So there is a history, a legacy, but there's also a reality today where certain religious actors and institutions have a very powerful influence over the political spaces around us. In fact, today, more than in the last couple of decades. It's just where we're at. Now, the fifth reason is very interesting, why religions matter. They're the most creatively self-resourced institutions in the world. Religious institutions have networks of volunteers that are incredible social capital. They know how to fundraise. So don't let us be fooled by, oh, we're suffering, we're not getting enough resources are being cut. Not within the religious communities that much, because they're counting on the oldest form of human capital. The largest volunteer networks are with religious institutions globally. People flock to serve their religious entities and their religious communities. They flock to serve. People see it as part of who they are and what they should do. Many people, if not in Western Europe, so sorry, it's not happening in Western Europe, it's happening in the rest of the world. So important that we understand. And today we're beginning to hear more about a very, very, very old reality. Anybody heard of Islamic financing? It's the oldest thing in town, but we're all suddenly aware of Islamic financing, and suddenly there's programs done by secular institutions in order to accommodate Islamic financing. By the way, Buddhist financing, Christian financing, the oldest financing networks, the oldest financial networks in town. So oldest political networks, oldest financial networks, just realities. And the sixth reason is that if religions are identified, which they are, as the source of terrorism, violence, extremism, and religious reasons are often given for why international human rights norms are not being adhered to. It's because of religious reasons, because of cultural reasons, Well, if that's the case, which it is, then how do we not take religions into account? How do we say, yes, these atrocities are being committed in the name of religion. These incredible serious human rights violations are being committed in the name of religion, but we're not going to take religion into account. It's okay. Let's just keep religion out of it for a second. Of course, we don't do that with Islam. We just do that with other religions. The truth of the matter is that if religions are the problem or identified as the problem, then they have to be part of the work we do to find a solution or a set of solutions. Yeah. So these are 6 reasons why it matters. I'm going to go very, very quickly to now where we are with this apparent contradiction, this ongoing perception that religions and human rights don't really mix or merge. I think I've provided enough evidence to show that there's actually, or at least enough talking to show that you can't really distinguish and say religions don't matter to human rights. They matter foundationally, and they matter in the enactment of everyday human rights. This perception that, oh no, religion, we don't need some religious leaders say we don't need human rights. We've got our sacred texts, we've got our traditions, we've got millennia of existence. We don't need human rights. Yes, that perception is very much there. It is an argument that is very powerfully articulated every now and then. Actually never stopped being articulated since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is, it's interesting that we see this dimension because we obviously have ignored the fact that we came to human rights through an appreciation of that which is common within all religious traditions. So we understand that this is a tension that seems to be articulated every now and then. But the truth of the matter is that it's something you can argue from here to kingdom come. The point is that those religious actors who see and struggle for human rights, think of liberation theology in Latin America, but think also of civil rights actors in the United States civil rights actors around the world who are inspired and who are themselves religious actors, religious leaders, religious institutions. This understanding that human rights is only realized outside of the framework of religion is completely false. It isn't the way things are. It wasn't the way things are going. It's not the way things are happening right now. In fact, those religious actors who see and struggle for human rights, and I'm convinced those are the majority, even if they don't necessarily identify as were human rights, they're religious actors who struggle for civil rights. They are also the ones who can articulate the rights and advocate for them most efficiently and effectively among all communities, because they're speaking the language of the everyday for 8 out of 10 people. So the articulation of human rights is best done, in my belief, is best done by religious actors themselves, because for them it's not either or. It's not either these human rights or my beliefs. In fact, these human rights are possible because of my belief systems. To realize them is to realize and to live my faith. That, at least, is where Religions for Peace comes from, and that is my personal faith. We cannot speak and advocate for any human right without an understanding and a conviction that the realization of human rights is the realization of our faith tradition, is to live our faith. It is the sacred act of serving our faith traditions, that realization of every human right. And what's even more interesting is that because faith actors don't necessarily always categorize, this is secular, this is religious, this is about the health, this is about education, this is about politics. Really, faith is an all-encompassing system of thinking. And as a result, those of us who serve from the conviction of faith serve the whole of the human rights. Very, very difficult to pick and choose and say, well, this human right I like. It's not cherry picking any particular human right. To live our faith, we must be committed to serve all human rights. And I want to then come to the last part of my deal breaker part, okay? But before I go there, I want to bring your attention to something called Faith for Rights. If you don't know it yet, please go check Faith for Rights, okay? Faith for Rights is basically something produced, a process, a journey, a manifesto that was produced by the UN Office for the High Commissioner on Human Rights, otherwise known as UN Human Rights, which worked with faith-based actors to conceive of this Faith for Rights framework. It has 18 commitments in line with the 18 Universal Declaration of Human Rights articles. So it's 18 commitments which they arrived at based on taking into account different religions and beliefs in all regions of the world, basically to promote a common action-oriented platform. It's almost as if this is the Faith for Rights is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights spoken of and articulated in multi-religious terms. And it's almost as if it's taking us back to how we got to the human rights agenda in the first place, by looking at the common religious ground, common values to all faiths. And this Faith for Rights document, so many years later, is about reminding us of that, the ways in which all faith traditions intersect with those 18 human rights articles. Please check it out. It's a superb initiative, attempt. It's fascinating, and you can take issue with it, but by taking issue with it, you will also engage with it, and I strongly recommend you do so. Now, this is all very nice. Yes, religions matter. They matter politically, socially, culturally, financially, economically, etc. So what's the issue? Well, the issue is, quite frankly, that we still think, those of us who work in the religious spaces, think of religions as the Catholic Church, the Protestant, the Anglican Communion, the different Jewish entities, beliefs, the Hindu, myriad Hindu presences, which it is all of that. The argument for the realization of human rights, however, is that you cannot only work in a world that is characterized primarily by diversity. Our world is very diverse, not because it became like this. It has always been like this. We are created different, for heaven's sake. We are created different. So diversity is not something that we acknowledge it today. How fascinating. No, it is who we are. That diversity, including of our beliefs, has to inform how we live and own and realize our human rights. Yes? It can't be that we do it as Catholics only, as Protestants only, diverse as they are, as Muslims only, Sunnah, Shia, diverse as they are, as Jews only. No. I mean, of course we need to do that too. But the real test to our ability to struggle to realize human rights, to own human rights, to live the human rights of everyone, barring none, no discrimination, every human right for every living species, not just human beings. If we struggle for that, we also must ensure in some way, shape, or form that it's not just one religious belief system or one religious institution or one faith community that is able to do this on its own, because none of us can do anything on our own. Right? Lesson number 155 from the COVID pandemic is we need to be dependent. We are interdependent, whether we like it or not. One person still affected by the COVID virus can still hurt anyone else gazillion miles away. We are so interdependent. Well, are we then not interdependent on our well-being, our general well-being? Are we not interdependent? Of course we are. Okay, what does that interdependence translate to? In the realms of faith, it translates into the absolute necessity for faiths, for religions, institutions, leaders, networks, communities to work together, to serve together. I spoke to you about how the faith institutions and religious actors are at the forefront as being first responders to the crises. Each of them working 1,000% more, largely on their own. The Catholics' infrastructure, which is massive, the oldest social service infrastructure known to humankind, by the way, and transported to the rest of the world through the colonial enterprise, that infrastructure is working to save hundreds of thousands of lives. Similarly with the Anglicans, similarly with the Jewish and Hindu and Buddhist, everyone is working 110% to serve. The question is, are we working to serve together? And I can tell you from now living in this space called Religions for Peace and having the privilege to see how different religions interact institutionally, individually, communally, I can tell you that it's very, very difficult to have the religious institutions come together to serve together. It's not difficult at all for them to be serving to save hundreds of thousands of lives, to serve the dignity of their people. That's not difficult. That's what they do. That's their normal. We've been saying that. The point is, it is so difficult, especially now, when the pandemic has brought up the worst of our fears, when the political systems around us have shown us serious shortcomings in terms of valuing human dignity for all, not just the dignity of some. Our political infrastructure is going through a crisis of legitimacy everywhere in the world. Multilateralism is in crisis. The ability of nation states to come together to serve together is in crisis globally. So is the multi-religious space. As states serve their own people, or try to, religions and religious institutions are serving their own people. As states are failing to serve together, religious institutions are also failing to serve together. This is where our genuine crisis of human rights resides. It is in that space where we don't work together, where we each are serving to the best of our abilities, but we are serving alone in our respective institutions. We are not trying to bring together the common good to serve it together. In an ideal world, when religious institutions can be the example for the political institutions by pooling their resources to serve all, barring none, no one gets left behind. No one is left behind. When the religious institutions can do that, they can set an example for the political institutions to do that. The truth of the matter is, however, that both the entirely political institutions and the entirely religious institutions are struggling with the idea that they can serve one another. The ultimate test is in whether one religious community is prepared to put its money to serve another. Because if we're all prepared to do that, we will find that there's very little that cannot be reached or cannot be done. Religions for Peace set up a multi-religious humanitarian fund, the first initiative of its kind, to try to encourage religious institutions and actors to pool a little bit of their resources, not all the resources, just a little bit of the resources, to put that into a common pool to serve. They serve together. It's been a challenge to make sure that that happens, not because the religious institutions are not working 110%, but because it's a challenge to be able to take from what we have that we consider dear and give to another religious faith community. And as long as that remains a challenge, our human rights will be extremely challenging. I leave it at that. Thank you very much.
I'm applauding on behalf of everybody present. Thank you so much for that very powerful and engaging talk. You're a wonderful speaker. That was fascinating to listen to and inspiring to listen to. And I'm going to invite our participants again to put their questions in the chat, type their questions in the chat if they have any for Professor Karam. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I just wanted to tell you that I not only that I very much enjoyed this talk, but I found that you made a number of compelling points and compelling arguments. I really like how you underscore the centrality of religious beliefs and belief systems for the development of human rights. I think a lot of us, a lot of people, even scholars, have this notion that human rights, the notion of treating each other with respect and equal opportunity, just fell out of the sky in the modern era, and nothing could be further from the truth. This builds on very old traditions, all of them coming out of faith-based belief systems. And another point that I think you made very well in this talk is that the prominence and the importance of religious leaders and religious organizations in promoting human rights around the world. And in my own field of study, which is based mostly in African American history, the civil rights movements are unthinkable throughout African American history, unthinkable without religious and church-based groups and organizations and associations, including Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Absolutely unthinkable without that link to belief systems, which is at its core very much a part of how they viewed civil rights and human rights, and how Americans and Westerners view human rights and civil rights. Professor Karam, I do have one question that I would like to sort of kick it off with, if that's all right with you. I'll take prerogative as the moderator to go ahead and ask the first question. You mentioned it when you were talking about sort of why religion is important. And the last point you made is if religions are identified with the problem. And I was just wondering, in your own work in Religions for Peace, how might, especially in conflict zones where religion is very overtly linked to part of the problem, and you don't have to look very far, obviously, like Northern Ireland, Israel, I mean, the biggies. How does religion play a role in helping to forge a solution to some of these conflicts, where it's associated with the problem itself, with the division itself?
So I don't mean to be facetious in my response. I think the whole point is we can let our faith become the spaces of contention, become the leaders. We can let our religious institutions and certain religious leaders divide us, or we can claim our faith and work with those religious leaders and institutions who are actually seeking to bring us together, to heal the wounds of the divisions. The most obvious way of thinking is that if you have these religious leaders and institutions struggling and at war with one another, and they really are the ones best able to stop that, to actually stop that, and to argue counter. I mean, it's the same thing what we see with nation states who are at war with one another. Who's going to stop that war? Ultimately, these warring parties have to stop. They have to find the peace agenda, at least a ceasefire agenda, right? I mean, that's the only way that conflicts are stopped. We don't have spaceships coming in from outer space to stop a conflict. It has to be the protagonists themselves who stop it. And there's obviously from looking at nation states and even non-state actors, there's an interest-based point at which the fighting becomes more harmful and more costly than the peace, the stopping of the fighting. It's not even peace, it's just stopping the fighting, fighting. Okay, that is an interest-based dynamic that is made, it's a calculation made by warring parties. In the context of our faith traditions too, there's an interest-based space there that happens, and you see it in Northern Ireland when even some of the most recalcitrant, religiously inspired political parties themselves took the decision that, okay, this is now actually not helpful. We're not winning, we're not gaining, we're losing. And you know what? The very same religions that we used, the very same discourse that we used to harness the power of the struggle, the rationale of the fight, that same discourse can now be reconfigured to harness why we must stop fighting and make peace. They own it. They own the discourse. They understand it. And there's an interest-based analysis that takes place there. So quite frankly, that's what we saw in Northern Ireland. That's what we saw in many other religiously inspired. That's what we're hoping to see. I mean, if you look at the dynamic of ISIS, you have ISIS claiming that the atrocities it is carrying out is religiously inspired. How is that going to stop? Well, two ways. One way is you're going to try to militarily deprive them of the advantages that they have, right? But the other way, that's actually the oldest way that's been happening, but nobody wants to talk about it because then, you know, it sort of reduces from that image of Islam as a very negative thing. The other way that's been happening repeatedly, systematically, since time ever, is that the Muslim leaders themselves, Muslim communities themselves are rejecting it, are rejecting the philosophy, the theology, the praxis, everything, and publicly rejecting and determinedly rejecting and trying to advocate against and trying to reconfigure the discourse that is being used to harm, to say, actually, no, this is not right. This is not what Islam is trying to say. But for us to look at that dimension requires a lot of effort. And it would take away, like I said, from the much more easier, much more convenient labeling of Islam as a terrorist inspiring religion, right? The other, that mean other. Actually, it's about as mean an other as any other religion out there or non-religious belief or philosophy. The point is, those who make war and harm in the name of religion are also those who are best able to stop the war and to heal in the name of religion. And if it's not the same actors, it's the same discourse. Our faith discourse is incredibly rich, and in it is what we choose to do with it. Do we choose the seeds of harm, or do we choose the seeds of peace? The reason that Religions for Peace has been advocating systematically that religions must come together. Why? Because therein, as we come together, there's no room for fundamentalism. As we come together across the different faith traditions, there is no opportunity for dogma. The very act of coming together in full admiration of the divine, in full support of that which is bringing us together, our faiths that hold us connected, that very act of coming together to serve together eliminates entirely the possibility of any fundamentalism, any dogmatism, any hint of terrorism in the name of any one religion. It is when we operate in our silos, religious silos, that we have then more room to be dogmatic and fundamentalist about what we think this religion means. But when we come together across the different faith traditions, per definition, We are coming to meet at that point of the center. That's the center of our faith, the center of our being. And that is the point where we can relate directly to one another, no matter which religion we come from. We come together with our religious conviction, but our religious conviction that is pulling us to come together to serve all. That point of convening for service to all is the point where no war is possible, conceivable. No conflict is possible, because we're busy seeing that which needs to be served. We are busy serving all, barring none. That is why multi-religious collaboration is a tipping point for the realization of human rights and peace and security and development. Governments have been saying this for a long time. The entire ethos of the United Nations is that when you come together, then no nation shall put that sword. We will all bury our swords. No, that's the whole point. Okay, what is it like when all religions come together? If we have lost the struggle for nation states to bury their swords, we must never lose the opportunity for religions, for faiths, to make it possible to not need any sword.
Thank you very much. That is a very convincing argument. Perhaps we have several questions trickling in, and perhaps just piggybacking on that theme. One question is coming from the University of California at Berkeley, from Aparajita Basu. Thank you for your question. It's asking, how can faith-based actors be motivated to choose religious interpretations that favor or prioritize universal ethics over articles of belief that are discriminatory towards certain groups? So how religions can be mobilized to promote rights for everybody, even when they're born sort of in a reaction or have built-in hierarchies to certain that favor certain groups. And I think you touched upon that in your answer just now, but perhaps you'd like to respond to that.
Yes, exactly what I just said.
Mm-hmm.
When I worked in the UN for almost 2 decades, working with different religious actors, we would get approached by the different Christian organizations separately and the different Muslim organizations separately and different Hindu representatives and so on and so forth. It was always separately, and they're doing amazing work. And the pulpit of the UN gave us, the UN actors, the servants of the UN system, an opportunity to say to all of these actors, do you suppose you could maybe just come together? Maybe just, instead of giving all these separate initiatives and proposals, which you'd like us to do with you, do you suppose you could potentially come together? Because we're the United Nations, we kind of need to work with all the united religions, so to speak. Do you all suppose you could do things together? And then we'd be happy, obviously happy to work with you. That was the logic that was basically, honestly, a utilitarian logic to say, why don't you all come together? How about, I mean, you're doing the same stuff. You're talking about doing the same things in the same places sometimes in the same countries, in the same communities, and for the same reasons, albeit expressed differently. How about you join forces? How radical is that? I have to say, we saw such important coming together that took place between, for instance, World Vision, Islamic Relief, Caritas, these major faith-based NGOs who were inching toward Lutheran World Federation, who are trying so hard and are now, in fact, leading projects and programs together, right? The point is that it's integral to a mission of faith that you serve everyone, that you don't discriminate, supposedly. Coming to serve together is exactly that tip. It's, I believe it was Einstein who said that genius is actually in recognizing the obvious. It's not the complicated theoretical, even though God knows he had plenty complicated theoretical stuff too. But genius is in recognizing the obvious. And frankly speaking, the genius here is in being able to recognize that when we work together to serve together as different religious or faith-based actors, therein lies the formula for coexistence, right? For social cohesion. Imagine a situation where it's not just one religious organization that's providing a hospital, but in fact, it's a whole bunch of them. that came together to provide and to serve in that hospital in a time of need, or a school. Imagine that. That'll be the day when you actually have different religious institutions coming together to offer educational facilities, where
Easy, doesn't it?
it beggars belief, yes. But it should be what we aspire. It is what we aspire to. We aspire to a space where every religion is strengthened in its individual integrity. Every belief system is harnessing the best of its own integrity by serving with the other religions and faith systems, right? That is the fundamental belief, if you will. It's not to say we have to develop a common religion. That's not at all the point. The point is indeed to approach from that space of deep conviction about one's own faith, and still to work because of that very deep conviction, as a Catholic, as a Muslim, as a Jew, as a Protestant, as a Hindu, as a whatever, to come together from that space of deep belief in our own, knowing that when we come together, we reinforce our faith, but we do so while we serve all. So it's that point of joint service to all that makes or breaks the opportunity. It's not about necessarily going back into your religious texts, and of course you can, and you need to, and I suppose many must. Go into your religious texts and find out where the verses are that say, and there are plenty, by the way, plenty, that say, hey, work together, serve the most vulnerable. Don't leave somebody asking and walk past them when they're asking, when they need. All faith traditions say that. All faith traditions say that. Indigenous peoples believe that even when you kill an animal, you must take permission and honor. So I'm sorry, all faith traditions maintain that act of dignifying through service, that you take as you give, but you give, right? And you give together. That is inherent to all faith traditions. If we actually enact it, if we live it, if we practice it, what would we be fighting about?
Actually, you just touched upon sort of two themes that came up in the questions, and we have a few more that we're going to get to. But one of the themes that you just mentioned just now has to do with indigenous beliefs, and as well as how human rights should apply to even the treatment of animals, and how this differs across cultures. So 𝐀𝐻𝐨𝐿𝐻 from the University of Leiden asks what your opinion is about the statement that human rights as a concept is too much a Western product influenced by Western views that does not place enough value on indigenous belief systems and practices. So how, to what extent that poses a problem. And an earlier question from Joyce de Silva was about how we should think of human rights as applying to the rights of animals. I think that these two topics that you just referred to in one sentence in your previous answer might work well for a combined question. Let me see, I don't hear the audio. I think you're still muted.
Yes, I do apologize. I have a head cold, not COVID. And anyway, we're too far away to, but just, can you please tell me what the two questions were again?
So the one was about if you would respond to the statement that human rights is too much of a Western product.
Yes. Okay.
That does not consider enough indigenous belief systems, including the systems of belief that human rights should apply to animals as well, or that certain rights should apply to animals.
Yes. So the point here is that we wouldn't have had a human rights agenda had we not looked at the values common to all faith traditions. It is true, however, that at the moment and at those points in our historical time when that process of coming up with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being undertaken, and it took place over many years, indigenous peoples were being treated abhorrently in many parts of the world. I mean, atrociously. But at the same time, and not but, and at the same time, we need to understand that if we were to look at that Human Rights Declaration, which is what the Indigenous Peoples Forum in the United Nations does, it takes that as its starting point. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a starting point for the coming together around and for indigenous people's rights globally. There is nothing in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that negates in any way or ignores the rights of indigenous peoples. On the contrary, it affirms the rights of all, every single individual, and therefore including indigenous people's rights. Where indigenous peoples have come together in different parts of the world to argue, to struggle for their rights, they have used the human rights framework. That has been integral to their struggle. So there isn't an either-or process here at all. The notion that human rights are supposed to be Western, some people do maintain that. I did refer to that in my presentation. Many will maintain, oh, it's Western, we don't need it, and so on and so forth. It's about as Western as any common understanding of that which ties us together is. It's just not true. We wouldn't have come to human rights if it hadn't been for the belief systems of the whole world. But it's a political strategy to say it's irrelevant, it's Western, we don't need it, and we don't need to use. Invariably, by the way, the folks who make that argument, oh, it's a Western system and a frame of reference and we don't need it. Invariably, those are people who come from spaces, institutional spaces and personal spaces, where the rights of others in general are not particularly well respected. They come from authoritarian spaces, marginalizing spaces. They are the ones who maintain, well, we don't need that, we don't need that, we've got our own. Well, where's the harm in seeing where your own coincides with that and in fact is reinforced by that? So my contention is that whoever uses that argument is using it out of a space where they wish to discriminate and to marginalize. Actually, they're not inclusive. There's no mercy in those spaces. There is only marginalization in those spaces. So that alone should, in a way, disqualify the arguments being made. And by the way, sometimes even in Western, and you mentioned the civil rights struggle in the United States, there was an attempt to put that out. It's human rights, put that out. Civic rights, the civic rights movement came on that premise that you will not marginalize or silence, that when we come together, the echo of our common shared human rights agenda is not a Western echo. It's an echo from the very deep heart that we have something to share, to benefit from coming together for the rights of all, that you cannot triumph on top of me, on my accord, but that together we can triumph. And I think this point, that every time you hear someone saying it's a Western agenda, look deeper. Where are they standing? What else are they thinking? And I'll bet you anything, it isn't a space of merciful inclusion and love for one another. So that's really the easiest way I would try to respond to that.
Thank you for that response. I'm getting a message that we have time for one more question. And so for the final question, I'd like to apologize to those who are also trying to ask questions and not getting in. But for the final question, perhaps we could bring it closer to home, to those of us who are located in Europe right now, at least. One of the questions comes from 𝐀𝐛𝐨𝐮𝐭, and he asks, you made the point that religious institutions and political structure, financial structure, have been intertwined over the course of history, of course. And he's asking, to what extent is this true for the current situation in Europe right now, where it seems that religious institutions have lost authority and lost prominence and lost influence? Has the place of religion been sort of taken over by notions of culture in Europe?
I would push back against that notion of Europe as a place where religious institutions have lost authority. I'm sorry, but some of the most right-wing philosophies that we see around us today and that have been there since time immemorial have had religious backing, have had various, apartheid as a system was justified by certain churches. It was justified. So there has never been that, oh, let's just cut this, right? Yes, many churches in Western Europe are being converted to all sorts of fascinating things, malls and galleries. Yes, that's true. But does that mean that the politicians are completely ignoring what all religious leaders are saying. On the contrary, there are very strong partnerships that are being, look at Hungary, look at Eastern Europe and some of those spaces where the political and the religious, look at the fact that we had a church that is ancient, the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Church that has tremendous legacy and history, had to split between Ukraine and Russia. We had two. Why? That was because of dogma? They suddenly discovered something new in the doctrine? No, that was politics. Politics at its best. Politics is religion and religion is politics. And it's a very, very heady combination. I am very sorry, but if we look at how, you mentioned Northern Ireland. Where is that? Is that not in Europe?
Last time I checked.
The truth of the matter is that we shouldn't judge by how we see certain institutions, because at the same time that there are churches that are being converted into galleries and malls, there are massive attempts to build mosques and gurudwaras and temples. It's just that the Christian hegemony, the white Christian agenda of hegemony is changing and having to defer to other faiths in those space. There is no longer a universal, unified Christian way of existing. And having said that, even with that, do we not all pay attention to what His Holiness Pope Francis says? We do, even in Europe. Every single political leader in Europe has asked for an audience with the Pope. Why? Why? If it doesn't matter. If really it's that marginal. Why? Because it matters. Because what the Pope says influences. And thank goodness he speaks beautifully. He makes plenty gorgeous sense on so many things. On some things. He does. He makes amazing sense. So where is this relationship not happening? Where is this break exactly? It's not true. It's not true. There's a symbiotic relationship between the religious and the political that we, even in Western Europe, the capital space of secularism, I'm sorry, not true. And I'm really sorry also to say that I don't think that right-wing nationalism would exist so well and grow in the way that it is growing without some kind of religious backing. And that is somewhere we don't want to go because it's kind of not nice, right? It sort of goes against all the theories of religion as a good thing. And I'm sorry, it wouldn't be as pervasive as it is today if it didn't have some form of religious backing.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Karam, I could talk to you for hours on this theme. You are so passionate about your expertise and so convincing in the way you convey your message and your ideas. I want to thank you again for participating in this event this evening with us, or this morning for you. And it's been a great honor to be able to moderate this session and to listen to you speak about these things that are so dear to you and so near to your hearts and so important to our world. I want to thank the participants for their participation and for all of the questions that came trickling into the chat. I'm only sorry that I could not get to all of them, but this was a really wonderful session, a wonderful talk. Thanks again to Afroditi from LeidenGlobal for organizing this event, and to all of you at home. Thank you very much for this. Have a nice evening.
Thank you, Professor Damian. Thank you very much. And thanks to the whole team. Much appreciated. Bye-bye.